November 17, 1944. The East China Sea, 200 miles southeast of Shanghai. Captain Tamichi Hara stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shigyur, watching the oil slicks spread across the water where the merchant vessel Myosin Maru had been steaming 30 seconds earlier. No explosion. No warning. The 10,000-ton cargo ship, loaded with rubber and tin from the Dutch East Indies, had simply broken in half and sunk in less than 2 minutes. Hara had commanded destroyers for 3 years. He had fought at Guadalcanal, survived the night battles in Iron Bottom Sound, and escorted hundreds of convoys across these waters. But this enemy, the one he could never see, never hear, never predict, terrified him more than any surface engagement ever had. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In his diary that night, Hara wrote words that captured what every Japanese naval officer had come to understand by late 1944. The American submarines are destroying us. Not dramatically, like carrier aircraft or battleship guns. They are killing us quietly, one ship at a time, until there is nothing left to defend. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, American submarines had sunk 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 5.3 million tons of shipping. They had strangled the Japanese Empire more effectively than any bombing campaign or surface fleet action. And Japanese officers, who had planned to fight a decisive battle against the American Navy, discovered too late that the war would be won and lost not in dramatic fleet engagements, but in the silent depths where submarines hunted merchant vessels carrying the resources Japan needed to survive. The tragedy was that Japan's naval leadership had known about the submarine threat before the war began. They had studied American submarine doctrine. They had analyzed the potential vulnerability of Japan's merchant fleet. And then they had systematically ignored those warnings, convinced that Bushido's spirit and aggressive surface tactics would overcome any threat from beneath the waves. This is the story of how American submarines became the silent killers of the Pacific War, told through the words of Japanese officers who watched their empire's lifeline severed, one torpedoed ship at a time, until the home island starved. The warning came from an unlikely source. Rear Admiral Kiyoshi Hasegawa had never commanded a submarine. His expertise was anti-submarine warfare, developed through careful study of World War I German U-boat campaigns and British countermeasures. In 1939, as tensions with the United States escalated, Hasegawa submitted a classified report to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. The document, captured by American forces in 1945 and translated by Naval Intelligence, revealed that Japan's senior leadership had received an accurate assessment of their vulnerability 3 years before Pearl Harbor. Hasegawa's analysis was comprehensive and devastating. He began with geography. Japan is an island nation that imports 80% of its oil, 70% of its iron ore, and 90% of its rubber. These resources must travel by sea from conquered territories and trading partners. The sea lanes connecting Japan to the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and China are thousands of miles long and impossible to defend completely. Any enemy with an effective submarine force can target these merchant vessels with relative impunity. He then analyzed American submarine capabilities. The United States Navy operates approximately 50 fleet submarines with an additional 30 under construction. These vessels can travel over 10,000 miles without refueling, dive to depths exceeding 300 feet, and carry up to 24 torpedoes. They are designed specifically for long-range commerce raiding against an island nation dependent on maritime trade. If war comes with America, their submarines will target our merchant fleet systematically. Hasegawa's report included calculations that proved prophetic. Based on World War I U-boat effectiveness against British shipping, he estimated that American submarines could sink between 800 and 1,000 Japanese merchant ships over a 3-year conflict. This would reduce Japan's merchant fleet by approximately 60% and cripple the nation's ability to sustain military operations. The actual number, 1,314 ships sunk, exceeded even Hasegawa's pessimistic projections. The report concluded with recommendations that were ignored almost entirely. Japan must prioritize anti-submarine warfare. We must develop convoy escort procedures, train specialized anti-submarine vessels, produce depth charges and sonar equipment in quantity, and establish a maritime defense command with authority equal to our surface fleet commands. Without these measures, American submarines will destroy our logistics, and we will lose the war regardless of battlefield victories. The Naval General Staff filed Hasegawa's report and proceeded with war planning that emphasized decisive surface battles and aggressive carrier operations. Anti-submarine warfare received minimal attention. Convoy escort was considered a defensive, unglamorous mission unsuited to the offensive spirit of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Depth charge production remained low priority. Sonar technology lagged years behind American and British developments. When war came in December 1941, Japan had built an empire that was systematically vulnerable to the exact threat Hasegawa had identified. The vulnerability was not immediately apparent. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, American submarines achieved relatively little. The torpedoes they carried, Mark 14 models with magnetic detonators, were fundamentally defective. They ran too deep, passed harmlessly beneath targets. The magnetic exploders triggered prematurely or failed to detonate at all. Submarine commanders, highly trained and aggressive, watched their torpedoes miss or bounce off Japanese hulls without exploding. Lieutenant Commander Mush Morton, commanding USS Wahoo, fired 9 torpedoes at a Japanese convoy in January 1942. Not one exploded properly. He returned to Pearl Harbor in fury, demanding that someone fix the torpedoes or let him ram enemy ships because at least that would accomplish something. Japanese naval officers, reading intelligence reports about early American submarine operations, felt relief bordering on contempt. Commander Takeo Yoshimura, who served on the Naval General Staff throughout the war, later described the prevailing attitude in Tokyo during 1942. "We knew the Americans had many submarines, but their performance in the first year was so poor that we began to believe they did not know how to use them effectively. Our merchant ships reported being attacked by submarines that fired torpedoes that did not explode. Our escort commanders reported submarine contacts that broke off attacks rather than pressing home. We concluded that American submarine crews lacked the warrior spirit necessary for aggressive warfare. This was a catastrophic misunderstanding. The misunderstanding stemmed from cultural assumptions that blinded Japanese leadership to the reality of what was happening. American submarines were not timid. They were handicapped by defective weapons and were methodically testing those weapons to identify the problems. By mid-1942, submarine commanders had figured out that magnetic exploders were unreliable and began using contact detonators instead. By late 1942, they had determined that torpedoes ran approximately 10 feet deeper than set and adjusted their firing solutions accordingly. By early 1943, the Bureau of Ordnance finally acknowledged the torpedo failures and implemented fixes. Japanese intelligence observed these changes but failed to grasp their significance. When American submarines suddenly became far more effective in 1943, Japanese naval leadership attributed it to luck rather than systematic problem-solving. The truth was that American submarine doctrine had been sound from the beginning. The weapons had failed. Once the weapons worked, the doctrine proved devastating. The doctrine came from Admiral Thomas Hart, who commanded the Asiatic Fleet before Pearl Harbor, and Admiral Charles Lockwood, who took command of Pacific Fleet submarines in February 1943. Both men understood that Japan's greatest vulnerability was not its navy, but its merchant fleet. Battleships and carriers could be replaced given time and resources. But if the merchant ships carrying oil, food, and raw materials from conquered territories never reached Japan, the home islands would starve and the war machine would grind to a halt. American submarine strategy was simple and ruthless: sink everything. Target tankers first because oil was Japan's most critical vulnerability. Target cargo vessels carrying raw materials second. Target troop transports and naval auxiliaries third. And do it systematically, across every sea lane connecting Japan to its empire. The submarines would not seek glory through spectacular single actions. They would win through attrition, one ship at a time, until Japan's maritime logistics collapsed completely.
If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this.
Japanese merchant captains encountered this strategy firsthand beginning in mid-1943. Captain Hidezo Ando commanded the tanker Kinyo Maru, a 10,000-ton vessel that made monthly runs between the oil fields of Balikpapan in Borneo and the refineries at Yokohama. In July 1943, he made his fourth voyage since the war began. His memoir, published in 1952, described the transformation he witnessed. The first 3 voyages were routine. We steamed without escort through the South China Sea and arrived on schedule. The fourth voyage was different. 3 days out of Balikpapan, the convoy ahead of us radioed that they were under submarine attack. 2 tankers sunk. We altered course. The next day, another convoy reported submarines. 4 ships gone. We altered course again. We zigged and zagged for 11 days, consuming extra fuel, arriving late. But we arrived. On the return voyage, we traveled with 2 escort destroyers. They dropped depth charges at every suspicious sound. We never saw a submarine. But 3 ships in our convoy did not reach Balikpapan. They vanished without distress signals. We found debris and oil slicks. The submarines were hunting us systematically, and we could not see them, could not fight them, could only run and pray. The inability to fight back demoralized Japanese merchant sailors more than the danger itself. Surface battles, even when lost, gave men the sense that courage and skill mattered. Submarine attacks offered no such consolation. A torpedo struck without warning. The ship broke apart and sank in minutes. Survivors floating in oil-covered water knew that the submarine might surface to machine gun them, or might simply submerge and move on to the next target. There was no honor in such a death, no chance to prove one's warrior spirit. There was only sudden violence from an invisible enemy, followed by drowning in darkness. Japanese naval officers recognized the psychological impact. Captain Tamichi Hara, who would survive the war as one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, wrote in his memoir of escorting merchant convoys in late 1943. The merchant sailors were terrified, not frightened in the way soldiers fear battle, terrified in a deeper way, like civilians trapped in an earthquake. They could do nothing to protect themselves. Their fate depended on forces they could not see or control. This terror spread through the merchant fleet until many experienced captains refused to command tankers. The pay was higher, but no amount of money compensated for the knowledge that American submarines were hunting you specifically, and you had no way to fight back. The hunting was systematic and scientific. American submarine commanders received excellent intelligence from codebreakers who had cracked Japanese naval codes. Station Hypo in Hawaii and Fleet Radio Unit Pacific in Melbourne intercepted Japanese communications and provided submarines with convoy routes, departure times, and even the specific ships in each convoy. This intelligence advantage was devastating. Japanese merchant captains plotted courses they believed were unpredictable. American submarines waited along those exact routes because they had read the orders telling ships where to go. The submarines operated in coordinated patrol areas called wolf packs, though American practice differed from German U-boat tactics. Rather than concentrate multiple submarines against a single convoy, American submarines spread across likely transit routes and attacked independently. This maximized coverage and prevented Japanese escorts from concentrating defensive efforts. A convoy might pass through one submarine's patrol area and escape, only to encounter another submarine 100 miles further along the route. The cumulative effect was that merchant vessels faced continuous threat across thousands of miles of ocean with no safe zones. The technological sophistication of American submarines shocked Japanese naval officers who had underestimated American engineering capabilities. Commander Takeo Yoshimura, interrogated after the war, described his growing recognition of American advantages. We knew intellectually that American submarines were larger and more capable than ours. We did not understand what this meant operationally until it was too late. American fleet submarines could remain on patrol for 60 to 70 days. Ours required refueling after 30 days. This meant American submarines could patrol the South China Sea and the waters around the Philippines continuously, while ours had to return to base regularly. American submarines could dive to 400 feet. Ours were rated to 250 feet. When we dropped depth charges, American submarines could descend below the effective depth of our weapons. American submarines had radar that could detect surface ships at night from beyond visual range. We did not have comparable radar until very late in the war. This meant American submarines could track convoys in darkness and position for attack, while remaining invisible themselves. The radar advantage proved particularly devastating. Japanese convoys traveled at night whenever possible, believing darkness provided protection. American submarines, equipped with surface search radar by mid-1943, hunted more effectively at night than during daylight. They could detect merchant ships at ranges of 10 to 15 miles, calculate intercept courses, and position ahead of the convoy for submerged attacks at dawn. Japanese lookouts, relying on visual detection, never saw the submarines until torpedoes struck. Captain Hidezo Ando described the futility of nighttime evasion in his memoir. "We traveled without lights, maintaining radio silence, changing course randomly. It made no difference. The submarines found us anyway. We did not know about their radar. We thought they were simply lucky or that we had spies reporting our movements." The truth, which we learned only after the war, was that they could see us electronically while we were blind. We were fighting with 19th century methods against 20th century technology. The outcome was inevitable. The inevitable outcome began to materialize in the statistics by late 1943. Japanese merchant shipping losses, which had averaged 50,000 tons per month in the first half of 1943, increased to 150,000 tons per month in the second half of the year. By early 1944, losses exceeded 300,000 tons monthly. The critical threshold came in October 1944 when American submarines sank 328,000 tons of shipping in a single month. This was more tonnage than Japanese shipyards could construct in 6 months. The mathematics of attrition became unsustainable. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By December 1944, approximately 4 million tons had been sunk and only 1.5 million tons of new construction had been completed. The merchant fleet was shrinking at a rate that would lead to complete collapse within months. Admiral Hasegawa, the analyst who had warned about submarine warfare before the war, watched his predictions come true with grim satisfaction. He had been assigned to Anti-Submarine Warfare Command in 1943, 3 years too late, to implement the defenses he had recommended. In his post-war memoir, published in 1950, Hasegawa described the desperation he encountered. "I arrived at my new command expecting to find a functioning anti-submarine organization. What I found was chaos. We had no standardized convoy procedures. Merchant ships sailed independently or in ad hoc groups with minimal escort. We had no dedicated escort vessels. Destroyers were pulled from convoy duty whenever the combined fleet needed them for operations, leaving merchants unprotected. We had no centralized tracking of submarine sightings or attack patterns. Each area command maintained separate records that were not shared. We had no anti-submarine training school. Destroyer crews learned by experience if they survived long enough. We had inadequate depth charges and sonar equipment. Production priorities went to offensive weapons because defense was considered shameful." Hasegawa attempted to implement convoy procedures modeled on British practice from the Atlantic War. Merchant ships would travel in organized groups with dedicated escorts. Escorts would be trained specifically in anti-submarine tactics and would remain with convoys rather than being diverted to fleet operations. Sonar equipment would be standardized and production expanded. Depth charge tactics would be systematically taught rather than improvised. He encountered resistance at every level. Fleet commanders refused to release destroyers for escort duty, arguing that this was defensive thinking that violated Japanese naval doctrine. Merchant captains resisted traveling in convoys because it required coordinating departure times and accepting slower speeds to accommodate the slowest vessels. Shipyards could not produce enough escort vessels because construction priorities emphasized carriers and battleships. The Navy Ministry could not impose unified command because the combined fleet operated independently and refused to subordinate its destroyers to convoy protection. By the time these organizational failures were partially corrected in mid-1944, American submarines had refined their tactics to the point where escorts had become largely irrelevant. Submarine commanders had learned to penetrate escort screens, attack from positions where escorts could not effectively respond, and evade counterattacks through superior speed and diving depth. Captain Hidezo Ando described watching American submarines defeat escort vessels that should have protected his convoy. "We sailed from Singapore in August 1944 with 4 destroyers escorting 8 merchant ships. This was the strongest escort I had seen. We believed we were safe. On the third day, an explosion struck the lead destroyer. Torpedo from ahead. The destroyer sank in 7 minutes. 30 minutes later, the second destroyer was hit. Also sunk. The convoy scattered as ordered. That night, another merchant ship was torpedoed. We never saw the submarine. The remaining destroyers dropped depth charges randomly. They detected nothing. By the next afternoon, 2 more merchant ships were gone. The submarine or submarines had defeated our escort and picked off targets systematically. Only 3 ships reached port from that convoy. The survivors concluded that escorts were worthless against American submarines, and that our only hope was luck. The hopelessness of the situation was magnified by the fact that Japan could not replace losses. American submarines could be, and were, replaced faster than they were sunk. The United States commissioned 122 fleet submarines during the war. Japanese anti-submarine forces sank 52, a respectable kill ratio. But those 52 losses were replaced within months, and the submarine force actually grew larger as the war progressed. Japan, by contrast, could not replace merchant ships at anywhere near the rate they were sunk. Japanese shipyards, already operating at capacity producing naval combat vessels, had minimal ability to construct merchant ships. The few merchant vessels completed took months to build and required steel and resources that were increasingly scarce as American submarines cut supply lines. The empire was caught in a death spiral. Submarines sank merchant ships carrying resources, which reduced resources available to build new merchant ships, which meant fewer replacements, which meant more shortages, which weakened shipbuilding capability further. The death spiral's impact reached the Japanese home islands by late 1944. Food imports from Korea and Manchuria declined as merchant shipping disappeared. Rice rations were cut repeatedly. Urban populations began to experience genuine hunger. Industrial production fell as raw materials from Southeast Asia failed to arrive. Oil imports dropped catastrophically. By early 1945, Japan's strategic oil reserves were nearly exhausted and tankers could no longer make the journey from the Dutch East Indies with any realistic chance of survival. The combined fleet, which had terrorized the Pacific in 1942, sat in port because there was insufficient fuel for operations. Fighter aircraft remained grounded because aviation fuel was rationed so severely that pilot training flights were canceled. The mighty Japanese war machine, which had conquered half of Asia, was being starved into immobility by an enemy it could not see or effectively fight. Commander Takeo Yoshimura, serving on the Naval General Staff, watched the strategic situation deteriorate throughout 1944. He had access to loss reports that revealed the full scale of the catastrophe. In his post-war testimony to American interrogators, Yoshimura described the moment when Japan's naval leadership finally acknowledged reality. In November 1944, we conducted a comprehensive analysis of merchant shipping losses and projections. The mathematics were inescapable. At current loss rates, Japan's merchant fleet would be reduced to 1 million tons by mid-1945. This was insufficient to maintain even minimal imports of food and fuel. The home islands would begin experiencing famine. Industrial production would cease. Military operations would become impossible. The analysis concluded that Japan had already lost the war, not through dramatic defeats in battle, but through the systematic destruction of our logistics by American submarines. We had been so focused on fighting the American Navy that we failed to protect the merchant ships that sustained our ability to fight. By the time we recognized this mistake, it was too late to correct it. The recognition came too late because American submarine commanders had become exceptionally skilled at their deadly trade. By late 1944, the submarine force operating in the Pacific was the most effective underwater combat organization in naval history. These were not the frustrated, ineffective commanders of 1942 struggling with defective torpedoes. These were veterans who had solved the technical problems, mastered their craft, and developed tactics that made Japanese defensive measures largely futile. Commander Richard O. Kane, captain of USS Tang, exemplified this evolution. In 5 war patrols between January and October 1944, Tang sank 24 Japanese ships, totaling over 93,000 tons. Okane's success came from aggressive tactics combined with precise calculations. He would track convoys for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the optimal attack position. He would penetrate escort screens by approaching from directions escorts did not expect. He would fire torpedoes at close range, sometimes less than 1,000 yards, where the probability of hits was nearly certain. And he would remain in the area after attacks, waiting for rescue vessels to arrive, then torpedo those as well. This ruthlessness horrified Japanese survivors. Captain Tamichi Hara, who investigated submarine attacks, described interrogating survivors from merchant ships Okane had sunk. The survivors told us the submarine surfaced after the attack and watched them in the water. They believed the submarine would rescue them or at least radio their position. Instead, when escort vessels arrived hours later, the submarine torpedoed those vessels as well. The survivors watched their rescuers sink and understood that the submarine commander viewed them not as human beings, but as components of Japan's logistics system to be destroyed systematically. This cold calculation was more frightening than hatred would have been. The calculation extended to target selection. American submarine commanders received intelligence about specific high-value targets and hunted them relentlessly. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies were priority targets. Large cargo vessels carrying raw materials were secondary targets. Troop transports were tertiary targets unless carrying particularly important units. This prioritization maximized strategic impact. Every tanker sunk reduced Japan's fuel supplies more than sinking a destroyer would have. Every cargo vessel carrying rubber or tin removed those materials from Japanese factories. The submarines were not just sinking ships. They were systematically dismantling Japan's ability to wage war. The dismantling accelerated through specific operations that demonstrated American submarine capabilities at their peak. Operation Barney, conducted in June 1945, sent 9 submarines into the Sea of Japan through heavily mined straits that Japanese planners believed made their home waters invulnerable to submarine attack. The submarines, equipped with new FM sonar that could detect mines, navigated through the Tsushima Straits at night and spent 2 weeks operating in waters where Japanese merchant ships had sailed without escort because they believed submarines could not reach them. The 9 submarines sank 28 ships, totaling over 54,000 tons, before withdrawing through the straits without loss. Japanese naval authorities learned of the operation only after merchant ships stopped arriving at home ports and debris was found floating in supposedly secure waters. Commander Takeo Yoshimura described the impact of Operation Barney on Japanese strategic planning. When we learned that American submarines had penetrated the Sea of Japan and operated there freely for 2 weeks, we understood that no waters were safe. Ships could not reach Japanese ports even through our home waters. The psychological impact was devastating. Merchant captains refused to sail. Cargo accumulated at overseas ports because no one would transport it. The few ships that did sail demanded escorts that we could not provide. The entire logistics system was paralyzed by fear of submarines that could appear anywhere, anytime, without warning. The paralysis was justified. By summer 1945, American submarines dominated Pacific waters so completely that Japanese shipping had effectively ceased. Merchant vessels that attempted to sail were sunk with such regularity that insurance became impossible to obtain and crews refused to man the ships. Japan had become a maritime nation that could no longer use the sea. The strategic impact manifested in ways that affected every aspect of Japan's war effort. The Imperial Japanese Navy, designed to project power across the Pacific, could not fuel its ships. The combined fleet, theoretically still formidable on paper, sat immobile in harbors. The super battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship ever built, was reduced to a floating barracks because there was insufficient fuel for operations. When Yamato was finally sortied in April 1945 for a suicide mission to Okinawa, the Navy could only provide enough fuel for a one-way voyage. The ship carried no fuel for the return trip because there was no fuel to spare and because everyone understood she would not return. American carrier aircraft sank Yamato long before she reached Okinawa, but the truly devastating fact was that Japan's most powerful warship had been rendered operationally irrelevant months earlier by the simple absence of fuel that submarines had prevented from reaching Japan. The Army faced similar paralysis. Divisions stationed in China, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia could not be reinforced or supplied adequately because merchant ships could not deliver troops or equipment. Soldiers in these garrisons consumed local resources and provided minimal strategic value because they could not be moved to where they were needed. When American forces invaded the Philippines in October 1944, Japan had over 500,000 troops in China who could not be transported to the Philippines because there was no safe way to move them across submarine-infested waters. Those troops remained in China, strategically useless, while American forces conquered the Philippines with opposition from the relatively small Japanese garrison actually present. The submarines had effectively cut the Japanese empire into isolated fragments that could not support each other. The civilian population suffered most directly. Food imports to Japan declined by 70% between 1944 and 1945. The average daily calorie intake for Japanese civilians fell below 1,500 calories, well below the level required to maintain health and productivity. Urban populations experienced genuine starvation. Children showed signs of malnutrition. Industrial workers lacked the energy to maintain production levels. The government implemented rationing systems that could not function because there was insufficient food to ration. Black markets flourished as people desperate for food traded family possessions for rice. The social fabric began to tear as communities that had endured bombing and military defeats discovered they could not endure hunger. American submarines, by cutting the supply lines that brought food to Japan, achieved what strategic bombing could not. They threatened the physical survival of the Japanese population. Admiral Hasegawa, watching the catastrophe unfold from his position in the anti-submarine command, understood that his pre-war warnings had been precisely accurate. In his memoir, he described a meeting with Naval General Staff in March 1945. I presented updated loss figures and projections. Since Pearl Harbor, American submarines had sunk over 1,200 merchant ships. Current Japanese merchant tonnage was approximately 1.2 million tons, less than 20% of what we began with. At current loss rates, this remaining tonnage would be gone by October. I stated flatly that Japan could not continue the war beyond autumn even if we won every battle, because we would have no way to transport food, fuel, or supplies. The officers present said nothing. They knew I was correct. But they also knew that acknowledging this truth meant acknowledging that the war was lost, and that it had been lost not through cowardice or lack of fighting spirit, but through systematic American submarine warfare that we had failed to counter. The failure to counter submarine warfare stemmed from multiple factors, but fundamentally from Japanese naval culture that valued offensive action over defensive operations. Convoy escort was defensive. Anti-submarine warfare was defensive. These missions lacked the glory of surface battles or carrier strikes. Officers who excelled at escort duty received no recognition. Officers who distinguished themselves in aggressive surface actions received promotions and honors. This institutional bias meant that Japan's most talented officers went to carriers and battleships, while less capable officers commanded escorts. The quality difference showed in combat effectiveness. American destroyer escorts, crewed by relatively junior officers and reservists, proved more effective at anti-submarine warfare than Japanese destroyers commanded by career officers because the Americans had trained specifically for that mission, while the Japanese viewed it as secondary duty to be performed when not engaged in real combat. The institutional bias extended to technology and doctrine. Japan developed relatively effective sonar by 1944, but produced it in insufficient quantities because manufacturing priority went to offensive weapons. Japan developed depth charges with improved depth settings by 1943, but did not standardize their use across the fleet because doctrine was never formally updated. Japan captured intact examples of American radar from downed aircraft, but failed to reverse engineer and mass-produce equivalent systems because research and development resources were directed toward offensive technologies like improved torpedoes for surface ships and aircraft. At every decision point, Japan chose to emphasize attack over defense, and American submarines exploited that choice ruthlessly. The ruthlessness was systematic rather than personal. American submarine commanders did not hate the Japanese more than other American servicemen did. But they understood that merchant shipping was a legitimate military target and that sinking every possible ship advanced American strategic objectives. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey, commanding USS Barb, demonstrated this systematic approach during a patrol in June 1945 when he surfaced in a Japanese harbor at night and used his deck gun to destroy trains and infrastructure while his crew planted explosives that destroyed rail lines. Flucky was hunting anything that supported Japan's war effort, not just ships. His patrol report, captured in American Naval Archives, explained his reasoning. Every train destroyed is troops and supplies that cannot reach the front. Every rail line cut is a logistics route denied to the enemy. We are not simply sinking ships. We are dismantling the enemy's ability to fight by attacking his logistics at every opportunity. This was total war applied underwater with methodical efficiency. The efficiency reached its peak in the final months of the war. By July 1945, American submarines had so thoroughly dominated Pacific waters that they were running out of targets. Merchant ships had stopped sailing. The few vessels that attempted voyages were sunk almost immediately. Submarines began attacking small coastal vessels, fishing boats, and anything that moved on the water because larger targets no longer existed. Commander Takeo Yoshimura, interrogated after the war, described the complete breakdown of maritime logistics. By August, we had essentially abandoned sea transport except for short runs between islands using small craft at night. The great shipping routes connecting Japan to the southern territories were empty. Ships that had survived sat in ports, unusable because there was no fuel and no willingness to sail into certain death. The Americans had achieved something unprecedented in naval warfare. They had removed an island empire's ability to use the sea that surrounded it. The removal was statistically documented. In 1942, American submarines sank 180 Japanese merchant ships, totaling approximately 700,000 tons. In 1943, they sank 284 ships, totaling 1.35 million tons. In 1944, they sank 492 ships, totaling 2.3 million tons. In 1945 through August, they sank 358 ships, totaling over 1 million tons. The progression showed accelerating effectiveness as American submarines grew more numerous, commanders more experienced, and Japanese defenses more inadequate. By war's end, American submarines had sunk approximately 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost, far exceeding the damage from aircraft, mines, or surface action. Japanese naval officers studying these statistics after the war reached uncomfortable conclusions about their own performance. Captain Tamichi Hara, who survived as one of Japan's most experienced destroyer captains, wrote in his memoir, "We failed to understand that modern war is primarily about logistics." The Americans understood this completely. Their submarines did not seek glorious battles. They sought to cut our supply lines, and they succeeded. We dismissed anti-submarine warfare as unglamorous defensive duty, and we paid a catastrophic price for that arrogance. The Americans who served on submarines received less public recognition than fighter pilots or battleship crews, but they contributed more to winning the war than perhaps any other branch of service. They understood their mission and executed it with merciless efficiency while we failed to counter them until far too late. The too late realization came in various forms as the war progressed. For Admiral Hasegawa, it came in 1943 when he was finally given anti-submarine command and discovered the organizational chaos that prevented effective countermeasures. For Commander Takeo Yoshimura, it came in November 1944 when loss statistics made clear that Japan had already lost the war through attrition. For Captain Tamichi Hara, it came in March 1945 when he escorted a convoy and watched submarines sink half the merchant ships despite his best efforts to protect them. For Merchant Captain Hidezo Ando, it came in July 1945 when he refused orders to command a tanker voyage because he knew it was suicide and no court-martial could be worse than certain death from submarine attack. Each realization carried the same bitter understanding. American submarines had strangled Japan systematically, while Japanese leadership focused on dramatic battles and decisive engagements that ultimately meant nothing because Japan could not sustain its war effort without the logistics that submarines destroyed. The submarines had killed silently, without glory or recognition, one ship at a time, until the accumulated losses made Japanese defeat inevitable. And Japanese officers, trained to think in terms of Bushido spirit and warrior ethos, discovered that modern industrial warfare was decided not by courage but by logistics, not by dramatic battles, but by systematic attrition, not by visible enemies, but by threats that struck from beneath the waves without warning or mercy. The final irony was that Japan had understood submarine warfare's potential before the war. Admiral Hasegawa had warned explicitly about the vulnerability of merchant shipping. Japanese naval planners had studied World War I U-boat campaigns and recognized the threat. But understanding had not led to action. The institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy valued offensive action so completely that defensive measures were neglected until catastrophe forced recognition. By then, American submarines had established dominance that could not be reversed with the limited resources Japan had available. The submarines themselves paid a price for their effectiveness. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, the highest casualty rate of any American military service. 22% of submariners who deployed never returned. These losses were acceptable only because the strategic impact justified the cost. Every submarine lost had sunk multiple Japanese ships before being destroyed. Every submariner killed had contributed to strangling Japan's logistics beyond repair. The exchange rate was brutally favorable. 52 submarines and 3,500 men lost in exchange for over 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping and the effective paralysis of an empire. Japanese survivors recognized this calculation after the war. Captain Hidezo Ando, who made his final voyage in August 1945 and survived Japan's surrender, described his post-war perspective in his memoir. "We hated the submarines more than any other weapon because they killed invisibly and gave us no chance to fight back with honor. But after the war, studying what had happened, I understood that submarine warfare was the most effective strategy America could have pursued. They targeted our weakest point, our dependence on maritime logistics, and they exploited that weakness systematically until our empire collapsed. We called them silent killers as an epithet. But from their perspective, that description was exactly correct. They killed silently, efficiently, without drama or glory, and they won the war in the Pacific more decisively than any other single weapon or strategy." Admiral Kiyoshi Hasegawa, who had warned about submarines in 1939 and fought them ineffectively from 1943 onward, summarized the lesson in his post-war memoir. "Japan lost the Pacific War when we chose to ignore submarine warfare as a threat. Everything that followed, the battles, the defeats, the destruction, was simply the consequence of that initial failure playing out over time. American submarines did not win through superior courage or warrior spirit. They won through systematic application of force against a vulnerability we refused to address. The silent killers were not silent because they were stealthy, though they were. They were silent because we refused to hear the warnings that told us they would destroy us. The warnings had been clear. The intelligence had been accurate. The vulnerability had been identified and documented. But Japanese naval culture, focused on offensive action and dismissive of defensive operations, could not adapt until the submarines had already achieved strategic dominance. By the time Japan implemented effective convoy procedures, standardized anti-submarine training, and prioritized escort production, American submarines had sunk over half of Japan's merchant fleet, and the damage was irreversible. The mathematics of attrition guaranteed Japanese defeat regardless of battlefield performance. In the final accounting, American submarines sank 1,314 merchant ships, 65% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost during the war. They sank 1 Japanese submarine carrier, 8 escort carriers, 1 battleship, 8 cruisers, and numerous destroyers and smaller warships. They rescued over 500 downed American airmen from waters around Japan, demonstrating capabilities beyond pure combat. They laid mines that sank additional vessels and closed ports. They conducted reconnaissance that provided intelligence for air and surface attacks. They transported supplies to guerrillas fighting Japanese occupation in the Philippines. They performed every mission assigned with effectiveness that far exceeded pre-war predictions. The Japanese officers who survived to study this record reached unanimous conclusions. Commander Takeo Yoshimura, in his post-war interrogation, "The submarines were the most effective weapon America deployed against us. Nothing else compares." Captain Tamichi Hara, in his memoir, "We feared carrier aircraft and battleships. We should have feared submarines. They destroyed us while we focused on the wrong threats." Admiral Kiyoshi Hasegawa, in his analysis, If I could change one decision Japan made before the war, it would be to take submarine warfare seriously. Everything else would have followed from that. The submarines had been called silent killers by Japanese officers who watched their merchant fleet disappear. The name was accurate. They killed without drama, without glory, without the pageantry of surface battles or carrier strikes. They simply hunted, fired torpedoes, and moved on to the next target. Ship after ship, convoy after convoy, month after month, until Japan's logistics collapsed and the empire starved. That systematic destruction, more than any battlefield victory, determined the outcome of the Pacific War. And Japanese officers, who had known about the threat before the war began, paid the price for ignoring it until after it was too late to matter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.